The program that I want to talk about tonight is questions and not answers. So let's go ahead and get started. Edward Weston called it the Phlegm of Recognition, and Minor White called it the moment of seeing. It's that feeling that you get when everything just seems to come together and you just have to capture the moment. It's those, I think everybody has probably experienced this at some point in time when you're out there with your camera. It's when you're no longer just looking at something. It's when you start to really see it and start to feel it as well. You're no longer really just looking at the thing itself, but you're looking beyond that and you're looking deeper into the force which actually generates the thing. You're looking at the essence of whatever it is. So let me just give you a few examples of what I mean by this. Death Valley is one of the places that I love to go to for many reasons. One, nobody can get a hold of me during my day job, and there's no cell phone reception or anything like that, and I can just get lost to myself. I don't take a watch or anything with me, so I don't know what time of the day it is or anything. It's just an amazing place, but it can also be a very difficult place to photograph. 20 Mule Team Canyon, where this particular photograph was taken, is really difficult, especially for black and white photography. And the reason for that is that the tones are very similar. So it's really all about the textures and the shapes. But it really is one of my favorite places to wander. There always just seems to be a surprise or two in store whenever I'm there. So on this particular occasion, I'd flown into Las Vegas and I was just looking for somewhere to stretch my legs. So 20 Mule Team Canyon is on the entrance to the park, that side of the park that I come in. So I got out, the day was drawing to a close. So I knew that I really didn't have very much time before darkness set in, but I did have my camera with me and I wasn't really seeing anything to photograph. And then this just happened as the sun was starting to set behind the mountains on the other side of the valley. And it was just something that I just had to capture. I just saw it and I just had to capture it. Very similarly, I'd spent a day photographing also in Death Valley up in an area called Ubehebe Crater. And I was driving back to base camp when a sandstorm picked up. And for anybody who's ever been in Death Valley, and if you've ever been in a sandstorm, it's pretty horrendous. You really can't see a hand in front of your face. So it gets pretty treacherous for driving. The visibility is down to almost zero. So I had to just park on the side of the road and just wait it out. And then when the storm started to clear, this scene just appeared before me. Again, the light was starting to creep through the clouds. The clouds were moving away and breaking up. And this scene just appeared right in front of me. And it was just something that I just had to capture again. It just seemed to be an alignment of what I was experiencing by being in this sandstorm, and then the sight that was in front of me, and I just had to take it. I mean, I would like to say that I had to hike for miles and miles and wait for the right conditions to appear before I found this photograph. But the reality is the photograph found me. I only had to get out of the car and take the photograph. I could actually have easily just stayed in the car and taken the photograph from inside of the car. But for me, that would have been just a little hard to accept. I had to do some effort. And then just rambling around, lost in my own little world. But this scene grabbed my attention as well. Rambling hills while rambling around. So in sum, really what was happening is my state of mind was aligned with the scene that was in front of me. Minor White suggested this alignment was called a heightened sense of awareness. It's something that, again, I'm sure everybody has experienced from time to time. It's when you're able to just empty your mind of everyday life and everything that's going on around you, your work, your home life, family, tax returns that have to be filed, everything else. So it's just those rare moments in time when your mind is empty and you're just able to enjoy the experience of the moment that you were in. It's really where unity and balance are in harmony. And both Edward Weston and Minor White were suggesting that we ought to pay attention to that feeling. Ask yourself, what is the light source? What is the direction and quality? And do the colors, tones, and shape of the scene strike an emotional chord within? And as you're listening to that, you're probably thinking about, you can use similar words when you're thinking about a great piece of music. Harmony is really where beauty exists. Doesn't matter whether it's something that you were visually seeing or something that you're listening to. It's where there is unity and balance that create the harmony in the sound that you're hearing. So if you like, beautiful images are like visual music. So ask yourself the question, what does a visual impression sound like? So just going back to Death Valley again very briefly, these photographs, the next couple of photographs, were actually taken on my very first trip to Death Valley. And just like everybody else, I needed to get out onto the sand dunes. So I got up early one morning before the sun came out and then just tracked over the Mesquite Dunes, not far from Stovepipe Wells. And many of my favorite photographers had photographed these dunes before me, and I was really standing on the shoulders of giants. My mind was filled with those iconic images and their poetic shots of the rising sun bringing life to the sand dunes. But beautiful as it was, I couldn't help but thinking that I was really cheating myself. These weren't really my shots. They belonged to the photographers whose images really filled my mind. They weren't my questions about this amazing place. They were answers that other photographers had already found. Harry Callahan suggested that to each of us, harmony occurs when there is a balance between the thing itself and the space that surrounds it. It's where the significant and the insignificant meet. But the question is, which is which? What is significant? What is insignificant? And who makes that determination? So with those thoughts in mind, I went back out onto the dunes again. Again, I was thinking that I was cheating myself because the images that I'd created weren't really my own. And rather than searching for answers that other photographers had found, I started to search for my own harmonious moments and ask my own questions. And I just decided, rather than, it's easy to wander for miles around the dunes, it's hard walk. So I just decided to stop. I found this very nondescript spot and just stopped and started to look around me and just absorb the amazing scenery that was in front of me and the time and the things that were happening in almost a fleeting type of an arrangement. And within just inches of my tripod, I start to see these amazing shapes forming. And instinctively, I start to take some photographs. They're very small, literally sometimes only inches in size, and they're fleeting. They'll last but a few seconds. But for me, they were moments of beauty, the simple relationship between light and shadow. And for those who are familiar with the ancient study of Notan, that's really all it's about. It's looking at the placement of the masses, the dark masses, and the tones against the light areas in the image. And by the way, just as a side note, we're always told to use light in photography. The conversation when you were talking about photography is all about the light. I'm going to suggest that we, rather than just thinking about photography as light, start to ask ourselves questions about the shadows as well. It's really, for me, the relationship between the light and shadow that affects the emotion and the emotional response in our images. So I would suggest, think about that next time you look at a photograph you love. Don't just look at how the light is working to make such a wonderful photograph, but think about the shadow as well and how the shadow is being used in the photograph. But just going back to my question for a moment, which is most significant, the shapes formed by the light or the shadows themselves? I think I would like to suggest that neither is more or less significant than the other, really. This collision between light and dark really just depend upon each other. So there is nothing that is significant or insignificant. It just is. So for example, when, do we embark on an intellectual journey each time we hear a beautiful piece of music or see a beautiful photograph or encounter a beautiful scene? do we really go searching for it, or does it find us? How often have you listened to a piece of music for the first time and it just really sings with you? It just really grabs your attention. You ain't going looking for that piece of music, it finds you. And I would like to suggest that objects in front of us, scenes, whatever it is that you decide to call them, they really find us. Yeah, we go searching with our cameras. We go out there with our cameras looking for things, but it's the hunt is not so much about whatever it is that you were looking for, you finding it. It's really about whatever it is that's there finding you and just resonates with you. So going back to those images of the sand dunes, for example, I went searching for iconic images, but what I came back with said nothing about my exploration of the world around me. But on that second trip, when I took those little intimate areas, showing the light raking across the small areas of the sand dunes, those particular moments found me. I just responded to instinct. And to me, these images, those images, they say a lot more about me and how I see the world around me. They're sometimes small, ordinary, sometimes significant, but also sometimes significant parts, are each important parts of what it is that makes up the whole. And for me, that is a vitally important question whenever I'm taking photographs. It's never about what is the more significant or the insignificant. It's about the small individual components that make up the whole. But this was not really my only aha moment. As I was thinking about this, I also realized that rather than working the scene to try and find an answer, I was responding to instinct again with those little intimate scenes on the dunes. I just positioned my tripod and just waited it out and waited for something to occur. I was responding to instinct when I started to see things that I wanted to photograph. So along with asking my own questions, responding to instinct became important parts of my approach to photographing the world around me. And I want to suggest that we keep that in mind. Just keep it in mind for a little while here, instinct, the word instinct and what that really means. But our friend Edward Weston suggested, when I find myself stopping to think, I know that I'm on the wrong track. So let's think about that for a moment and try to figure out what it is that we think Edward Weston was really saying. And what I think he was saying was, when you find something that really grabs your attention, how often do you start to think about other similar photographs you've seen and whether or not this will be a good photograph? So, such thoughts as these will unfortunately influence the decisions you make about how to compose the image, and therefore often result in an image that takes something away from the response you had when you saw it in the first place. Now, don't get me wrong, working the scene is extremely important, and I'm not disputing that. Of course, you really need to learn your craft to be able to give you the tools that you need to embark upon this journey of discovery. And therefore, you must ask yourself questions about exposure, composition, light and shadow, etc. But take a look at a film reel of the photographs you've taken from a particular scene, film reel or your digital outlay when you bring them into Bridge or into Lightroom, whatever it is that you do. Just take a look at them. Take a look at all of those photographs that you've taken of a particular scene, and then ask yourself, which is the one that you end up working with in post-processing, whether it be in the wet darkroom or in digital processing, and how many times is it the first or the second? And I think that for me, most often it is either the first or the second. And I think that the reason for that is they're more representative of the instinctual response that I had to the scene in front of me. Every image that I take after that, I'm already starting to think about other images that I've seen that look similar to this. And I'm already starting to think about whether or not this is going to make a good image, whether it's going to be accepted, whether I'm going to get a like on Facebook for it or what. So all of those other extraneous thoughts that are coming into the process, for me, distract and detract from creating an image that says more about your instinctual response to the world around you. So I guess my suggestion is, don't ask how we photograph something, but rather why we photograph it. Minor White suggested we really should not judge or edit our responses to a scene, but merely observe them for the sake of self-knowledge. But I have to be honest, it is really difficult. Our education trains us to solve problems. Through our schooling, we're told to find solutions to questions. Yes, we need to ask questions, but the focus is on finding the right answer. We search for answers to problems in our everyday lives, whether it be at work, at home, or at play. Why can't we just instead ask questions and just let the answers find us? Again, like those little intimate scenes that I saw upon the sand dunes in Death Valley. Just let those answers find us. Don't look for the answers. Just ask the questions. The answers will find you. Because I think that allowing the answers to find us really opens up our mind. Christine Bowler's Painter said in her seminal book, The Artist's Rule, the artist speaks to that part of you which yearns for beauty and creativity. So I think that opening up our mind allows us to be receptive to the beauty that really does surround us, no matter the occasion, situation, or location. We each see it in different ways, even if it's been photographed a million times. You often hear the story about, a group of photographers will go out and you'll all end up looking at the same thing in front of you and you'll all end up pointing your camera at it. But I can pretty much guarantee that each and every one of you will come away with a different image from what it is that you saw. And the reason for that is because we all see it differently. Again, going back to our friend Minor White, he suggested our resulting works are mirrors of ourselves. And through examining our work, we encounter ourselves. We're creating images of ourselves and our real responses to the world. And what we're doing is we're seeing a reflection of our own processes of growth and discovery. So I'd like to just share a few images now that will serve as some examples of what I've been talking about so far. This first set of images that I want to go through are, these were all taken when my mother was dying a few years ago now. And as with anybody who is going through that experience, you're asking yourself lots of questions about why. Unfortunately, there are no answers really. And as much as I wanted to, I really couldn't change it. I only had my questions. So I went out with my camera to try and escape. But when I looked at my images, the questions were actually all there. This first image was taken on the day I arrived back in England and saw my mother for the first time in almost 2 years, when she was already quite ill. We had no idea just how ill she really was. But seeing her looking as ill as she did opened up a huge chasm in my feelings. And in this image, this is a beach that I've walked a million times in my childhood, but I never saw it the way that I did, with the feelings of grief that I had. Grief really has a way of removing you from the world. And I guess I was fortunate that I had my camera with me to capture those particular feelings. And this scene reminded me that there is always hope within darkness. I was just sitting in my car on the edge of this wilderness area, not far away from where I grew up. The wind was howling and the rain was pouring heavily. It really kind of adds weight on top of the grief that you're already experiencing. So I wasn't really in much of a mood to take photographs, but all of a sudden this small ray of sunlight illuminated this bridge in the distance, and I just had to capture that particular moment. And then this castle, it sits on a headland, an isolated headland on a beach not too far away from where I live. It was a cold, dark February morning this particular day that reflected perfectly the coldness and the darkness that sat really heavy in my heart. And this particular photograph was taken the day after I learned that my mother's illness was terminal, and I felt lost and pretty isolated. And then this final image in this little series, this one was actually taken on the day that my mother died. It had significant meaning to me, and each time I look at it, I am still gripped with grief, even though it's now been 4 or 5 years since my mother passed away. Whenever I look at this image, it always reminds me of her. But one thing I want to mention is that absent the backstory behind these images, you may have formed your own connection to them it's important to know that we all have our own connection to each and every image that we create. But once we release them into the world, we no longer own the story. Anybody who looks at an image creates their own connection. So this was a very important time in my photographic journey, the realization of the power of emotion in images, and allowing myself to just respond to my feelings and capture my emotional response to a scene. Again, I wasn't going out looking for these particular images. Yes, I was out with my camera and wanted to photograph something, but I didn't find them. I'd like to think that the scenes really found me because I was digging deep into my emotions. Actually, I didn't need to dig deep because I was already heavily burdened with emotion because of the grief of my mother passing away, but being ill and passing away. So I like to think that these images really found me. Another photographer whose work I really admire, Paul Capronegro, suggested that such images are not really thought out, but they're made with inner quiet. And for those who are familiar with the work of the painter Mark Rothko, he once famously stated, "I don't express myself in my paintings, I express my not self." Think about that for a moment. We think we know who we are, and we think that we know what it is that we want to photograph and what images it is that we want to create from those photographs. But if you can remove yourself from the images, the self that you think you are, and allow your subconscious self to come through, and allow your subconscious self to tell you when to take the photograph. I think that's what Mark Rothko was really saying. He doesn't express himself in his paintings, he expresses his not self. He just allows his inner self to be able to paint whatever it is that he puts on his canvas. So these particular images in this little series, and other images as well, they really come from deep inside of ourselves, our real self and our response to what is going on around us. So moving on from grief really takes strength to reconnect and weave yourself back into the fabric of living, to give yourself a chance of some future happiness. So after my mother's passing, I spent a lot of time thinking about my childhood, and it stirred up a lot of old feelings, and I reacted to those feelings in a series of images that I took of one of my kids. And these images were all taken pretty much within the year after my mother passed away. Several of them, like this one, were taken during a trip back to England with my kids. I had actually played in these fields as a child, and while darkness still hung over me, I wanted my kids to have the same experience that I had as a kid, just running free in the world and experiencing the world. This is my middle daughter, and she features in each of the images that I have in this series. I didn't consciously choose her as my subject, but upon reflection, I think it's because of each of my kids, she is the one who is so much different than I was as a kid. She's very free-spirited and she makes friends extremely easily. She is very extroverted. Diane was asking me earlier if I was an introvert or an extrovert. I would like to think that I am very introverted. So my daughter is extremely extroverted. So there's a big contrast there between myself and herself. And I think that had a lot to do with why I chose her to be the muse, if you would, in my photographs. This one was one of my favorite places to play. It was a little ways away from where I lived. So each occasion we went to this river and the stepping stones was a very special time. So it's one of the places that I wanted to take her and take photographs of her. And then the next couple of images in this series were all taken back in Baltimore. So after returning from England on this particular trip, I wanted to continue the exploration of my childhood through my daughter. And each of these images were captured on the same day around an abandoned house. And she was really a terrific muse and just very, very patient with me. But responding to instinct was not enough. So everything that I've really been talking about up until now was around asking questions about instinct and just responding and allowing yourself to respond to instinct rather than thinking about all of those other photographs that you have seen, that other photographers had taken, and overthinking what it is that you need to do in order to be able to capture an image. So instinct was not really enough. It's not the only question that I had. So I wanted to kind of explore that a little bit in the next series of images in a segment that I call the contemplated landscape. So just a little backstory. At the beginning of my journey in photography, I wanted to be a landscape photographer. All of the photographers that I admired at that time, and still do, were landscape photographers. And I was drawn to the beauty in their images of massive scenes. But even in those early days, even without knowing it, I was responding to my feelings and without even trying instinctively to capture intimate moments in the wider landscape. So these first few images, these were all taken within just a few feet of each other in Canyonlands National Park in Utah. This particular image, there is a little bit of a story to it. While I was in Moab, I got to spend some time photographing with Bruce Baum during a workshop that he was running for the Moab Photography Symposium. For those of you who are not familiar with Bruce Baum, he is one of the modern day iconic photographers. And he is a person that what I would consider to be a living legend in the world of black and white photography. He really is somebody that you pay attention to when he tells you something. So we were taking these photographs in Canyonlands, and Bruce would come around and he would ask us questions about what it is that we were doing and why we were doing it. And he came up to me and he asked me if he could look through the viewfinder of my camera to see what I was taking a photograph of. And he saw what I was doing, this is the resulting image. And he said, "Do you really want to take a photograph looking directly into the sun? Everything's just going to be in shadow in the foreground." And I thought, good grief, if Bruce is asking me this question, this guy is a living legend. If he's asking me this question, there must be something that I'm doing wrong. And then I thought about it a little bit and I thought, well, something told me that this is what I wanted to do. So I just responded to Bruce, and fearful of what he was going to say to me, he could have thrown me off of the top of this mess or into the abyss below. But I just said to him, I said, "Yeah, I'm pretty sure that that's what I want to photograph, Bruce." And he just turned around to me and he looked at me and I thought, here we go. But he just said, "That's good. Keep on going." And I think what he was really trying to do there, he was trying to make sure that we understood that what it was that we were looking at through the viewfinder in our camera and the photograph that we wanted to create was really something that we wanted to create. It's something that we wanted to do, not something that we felt we had to do because we'd seen such images before or whatever. I think what he was also suggesting, there is no right or wrong answer. Just allow yourself to be. I just love these bristlecone pines as well. The shapes that they make are absolutely wonderful. They're almost looking, it's almost looking like you're twisting and turning in a dance scene. And this particular image was taken one morning. We were walking into a canyon, and the walls of the canyon were very high and the light had not yet started to come over the top of the canyon walls. And we were just walking and turned around a corner, and all of a sudden I just saw this cottonwood in front of me that was backlit. The sun was just shining through the leaves of this tree, just making them an almost pure white. And it was just one of those magical moments. And I just had to stop, put down my tripod and just take this photograph. Everybody else had continued to walk on in front of me and do their own little thing. And I had to play catch up a little while after, but I just instinctively just stopped and had to take this particular photograph. It was just an amazing moment. And again, it's one where I just felt that I was connected to the scene, and just rounding that corner and seeing it was very metaphorical, because I wasn't looking for this, it found me. And in the same canyon, this little intimate scene grabbed my attention. The canyons can be pretty foreboding places, but even inside of these areas, beauty in life exists. And it's about finding it. And again, it's not about you finding it, it's about it finding you, and you just taking that moment to go ahead and take the photograph. Banff National Park is one of those places that I just love to go to. I'm very fortunate. My company has an office in Calgary, which is about a 2-hour drive outside of Banff National Park. So every time I go up there, I would add on an extra few days and drive up into Banff. And on this particular occasion, I was staying in the northern part of the park around the Lake Louise area, for those who are familiar with Banff National Park. I got up early this one particular morning to go hiking up into the mountains. I knew that from the weather forecast the day before, that morning was going to be a little warmer. So I expected that there might be some fog around, but quite honestly, I started the hike, it was still dark. So I was kind of walking up there with my headlamp. But as the light started to come through, I realized that the fog was a lot more than I thought it was going to be. It was just fog. I couldn't see a single thing in front of me. So again, I was faced with a bit of a dilemma. Do I keep on going? Or do I turn back and go do something else? And I thought to myself, you know, the reason I wanted to go on this particular hike was not so much to take photographs. It was because I wanted to have the experience of just hiking up in the mountains. So I made a very quick and conscious decision that no, I was not going to turn back. I was not going to go do something else. I was just going to continue doing what I was doing. I just wanted to enjoy the experience of being there. And walking around in the fog actually is very surreal, especially when you can't see very much around you. You just feel like you're walking in empty space. And it actually helped put my mind in what I talked about earlier, this heightened state of awareness. I was just connected to myself. I was just watching one foot go in front of the other. I wasn't distracted by anything else that was going on around me. I was just allowing myself to enjoy that experience in that moment. And then all of a sudden, the clouds started to lift and these mountains just appeared. And I was just totally blown away. And these are just isolated moments that you just have to photograph and you just have to capture. The mountains are just absolutely massive. And to watch them appear through the fog as it was starting to clear was just, it was a very spiritual moment. It really was. And then driving along the edge of a valley, I saw this. It's actually snow blowing off of the trees, but what I saw was just this huge butterfly spreading its wings and taking flight. Minor White had also once suggested, don't take a photograph of something for what it is, but for something else that it possibly could be. And I would like to think that this is not so much a photograph of trees and snow blowing from it, but again, thinking about this as a giant bird or a butterfly or something just spreading its wings and taking flight, was thinking about this in terms of something that it could also be rather than just what it was. There was an interesting story about this particular one as well, this particular scene, similar to the other mountains that I was walking around up in Banff. I was walking around Lake Pito area and it was very foggy, but there was also, there had also been a lot of snow the night before. So there was no footpath that I could tell of while I was wandering around. And yes, I know it was probably pretty dangerous to be out there because you just never know what's sitting underneath of the snow. But I just found this tree, this fallen tree off of the beaten path, and I just sat down. Again, could not see a hand in front of my face because of the fog, but I just allowed myself to experience the quiet and the solitude of that particular moment. There was no wind blowing the trees. It was foggy, so I couldn't see anything. So my senses were heightened, and I was just trying hard to listen to things. I was trying hard to see things. I was feeling the cold. Then all of a sudden, the fog just broke and the sun started to shine through, and this scene in front of me just revealed itself. And once again, just instinctively responded to the moment and captured, or took the photograph and captured the scene. On another occasion, a little closer to home this time, this was back in the Baltimore area, the repetition of these trees and the uniformity in the relationship of their sizes just really grabbed my attention. The design of the scene in front of me is what caught my attention, and I just wanted to grab that particular moment. And then, although this one is completely different, I started to ask myself questions about, well, what happened to the other tree that almost seems like it should have been there to fill the gap between the trees? And then this particular scene reminded me of isolation. One other thing to keep in mind as well is that although we're each a very small part in this vast world that we live in, we can all stand out when the conditions are right. So that's what this scene and this particular image reminds me of. But it's also important to remember that the landscape is not just about nature. We have and we continue to have a significant impact on the landscape, and it can't go unnoticed. Man's impact upon the landscape, whether it be positive or negative, just is, and man is an important part of the landscape. This particular image was taken on a road trip in down East Maine, late one fall, a few years ago. And then this particular image was taken during this trip to Scotland. And I've included it here really just to serve as an example to illustrate the importance of one of the few technical things that I'll talk about, the importance of what I call a figure-ground relationship. And often we think about figure ground, we think about the figure, which is the subject, and its background. How does that figure sit within the background? So in this particular image, you could think about the castle is the figure, and the background of the mountains and the clouds or whatever. But I deliberately included the foreground here as well. And the reason I did that, and the reason I wanted to share this in particular, is because I feel that a foreground in an image is often as important as the background, and as I think in this particular example, can actually be more important than the background. And the reason for that is, as you can see, the reeds are moving. The reed, without the reeds moving in the water, I think that the image would be flat. They don't just add dimension to the scene, but they also, the movement of those reeds suggests wind and stimulates the senses of feeling and sound. Going back to one of the things that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, just ask yourself questions around what does the visual impression of sound, what does a visual impression sound like? So again, with images, you can create or stimulate the senses beyond just sight, beyond just whatever it is that you're looking at. You can create images that make you feel the cold. You can create images that make you hear the running water or make you hear the wind. This one I included just because I enjoy the design of symmetry in these windmills sitting in the ocean, again, not too far away from where I live. Often when I'm looking at the relationship between mankind and the landscape and man's involvement in the landscape, I often do look for design elements to try and see if I can't find symmetry, not just to illustrate the balance between man and the landscape, but also how that balance can often be harmonious as well. And this particular image was taken not too far away from where I grew up in England. It might be difficult to see on here, but just at the right-hand top edge on the horizon, you can see those wind turbines that I had in the previous image. But again, as I was mentioning earlier, while I was trying to capture these intimate moments, I still felt that there was something missing from my work. A little like the images of the sand dunes in Death Valley, these were not really my images. Each time I took one of these images of the grand landscape, I really found myself drawn to even more intimate details. But for whatever reason, I was refusing to allow myself to go there. And I think it was probably out of fear of what would be accepted. You know, images like this one that you see are generally accepted because they show the larger landscape, the massiveness of the landscape. But the following images that I wanted to share with you are really smaller parts of this particular image that I allowed myself to capture. And they actually started to speak to me more about the grander landscape, more than what the grander landscape did. So you can see here, this is just a part of the pier, and it's just the design elements again of the pier. This was taken on a somewhat foggy morning, so I was able to remove all distracting elements in front of and behind the pier. And similar to this one as well, also that pier, but it's just a portion of that grander landscape. And these ones just speak to me with greater volume than the images that I was taking of the grander landscape, the ones that I felt would be much more accepted. So allowing myself to kind of capture these more intimate details of the grander landscape, I was really asking myself some questions. What is the message? And these are questions that we should all ask ourselves when we're taking photographs. What is the message? What is it? What is the story we're trying to convey? So we should focus on the message and the story, not so much the subject. But sometimes I have no idea why I take a photograph of something, but for me, that's growth. I want to get outside of my head and stop trying to intellectualize and just allow myself to simply respond to my heart, my intuition. And that for me was probably the greatest aha moment in my journey in photography. So I try to intellectualize something. I try too hard to capture something that I think is filled with meaning or tells a lot about the subject. It's implicit and explicit, trying to balance those things. But I think the biggest aha moment was this whole concept of just allowing myself to respond to the moment. It'll find you. It found me. And I just responded without thinking too much about whether or not what I was capturing would be something that would be accepted. So I want to share a few images now in this particular series that I call Ghost Town, just to try and illustrate, I'll give some examples of what I've been talking about as well. So while I was drawn to this landscape, it wasn't really the only thing that grabbed my attention. As I mentioned, it's the small ordinary parts that make up the whole that often grabs my attention. But I was actually in very dangerous territory. Yes, I was becoming known for my landscape images, but I was attracted to other things around me too. So I began to question my style, but I quickly realized that my idea of style was all wrong. Even if we don't know it, insight is actually buried in our work. And when I started to look closer at my images, I began to see things that tied them all together. It didn't make a difference what I was photographing. There was something else that was tying them all together. So I guess my suggestion here is if you're ever feeling the need to question your own style, look closer at work and ask yourself, what is it that's tying all of these images together? In other words, what is the insight that you are bringing to these images? It doesn't make a difference whether you're photographing a building, a field, a person. There is something that is going to tie all of those images together, and I would suggest it's your insight. So just take a closer look at your images and ask yourself questions around what it is that is tying them all together. This realization really allowed me to be open and simply respond to those feelings that I had of the significance in the ordinary. So back in Death Valley again, although it's a vast and often overwhelming landscape, Death Valley is littered with stories of past lives. Despite its name, it has significant human history. There are many instances of the coexistence of man and the landscape, but it's important to remember that we don't own the landscape. It only gives us temporary permission to be there. And in this particular image, you can see that what we've got here is a tank, a water tank or some kind of a tank, just sitting within the vastness of the landscape of what is Death Valley. And the tank is in a state of decay, but it sits within a landscape that has existed for millennia. So the landscape is really only temporary. And again, it isn't so much the grand landscape that I felt myself drawn to, but rather my emotional response to those small parts that have their own story. And once I allowed myself to pull away from the larger scenes and allow myself to capture these more intimate details, I began to feel that I was writing my own story. These are my images, the reflection of the questions that I was asking myself when immersed in a particular scene. I've photographed the ghost town of Rhyolite just outside of Death Valley on many occasions with no resulting images that I really could call my own. Again, I've seen the infamous images that Edward Weston and other photographers had created, and they spun around in my head every single time that I took photographs of Rhyolite, trying to create images that would be as accepted as those that Edward Weston and others had taken. They weren't really my own, but now I was starting to feel that I was taking images that I could call my own. So this particular occasion was a little bit different. I'd just taken a hike in the area surrounding Rhyolite and was making my way back to the car when I saw the sun falling and just hitting the face of this often photographed structure. So again, the relationship between light and dark, what's good in the world and what isn't, that's the real subject here. It isn't so much a photograph of a building in Rhyolite, it's what it stands for, it's what it means. And this relationship between light and dark really reminded me of what's good in the world and what isn't. That for me is the real subject. When you look at this particular image, those little small squares that you see going across the middle of the window, they're actually small squares of notepaper, but there weren't any notes on them. And I asked myself, why? Why are they there? What purpose do they serve? So again, these are questions that were left unanswered, but I had to capture those questions. I didn't find an answer. I think that the answer probably found me in the image that I was able to create as a result of taking the particular photograph. This one was a really interesting one. I was in a little ghost town outside of Death Valley, just fell upon this ghost town, just driving around. So I thought I would get out and I would wander. And there was a house that looked like it had been boarded up for God knows how long. But there was one window that was just covered in dust, and I just took a rag and I just wiped off the dust and I looked inside of the building, and it was clear that it had not been, nobody had been in this building for God knows how long. I really don't know how long. So this photograph was actually taken through the window. And what you're looking at here is some beer bottles or something. There is a chair, there is a notebook. So this is not an image about beer bottles on a table or a notebook or a chair. The story behind this is what happened to the person? What happened to the people that lived here? It seems that the last time that a person was in here, they were doing something with their notebook. Were they drinking and writing down their life story? Lots of questions. What was it that they were doing? So again, it was the questions that I was capturing in the image, not necessarily the answers. And the story that I started to build in my mind influenced the final decisions that I made on what I wanted to capture within the scene. This was a butterfly that was clearly long dead, and it was trapped behind an old Gaussian curtain, again in this same area that I was exploring. And it just reminded me of, even in death, there is beauty. The tones of the wings and the pattern and the wings and the texture of the wings on the long dead butterfly, to me, were just extremely beautiful. And then this little bush I found, believe it or not, but it was still alive, but clearly it was only just clinging on. It's a story about survival. Again, it's not a photograph about the little bush. It's a photograph about a story of survival. That is the real message within this image. Life exists everywhere, no matter the location and the conditions. It's what we make of it that counts. So just like Death Valley itself, our existence and our lives are hanging in the balance, and it's up to us to decide how we want to live our lives. And then I was drawn to the patterns that were created by corrosion on metal in this image and in this particular image. This one reminded me of the snowy mountain ranges that I had visited when I was up in Banff National Park. Those last two images in particular were very important to me. And the reason for that is for the past couple of years now or so, I found myself more drawn to the abstract. While I've always been fascinated with abstract in the landscape, more recently I've been drawn to abstract in everyday, ordinary scenes, searching for some kind of beauty and imperfection. On reflection, it's no coincidence that my search for some kind of order within the chaos of the scene that I was photographing has taken place in somewhat challenging times. Of course, in recent times, we've gone through some pretty significant political upheaval and the pandemic, all of which have affected us all. And thankfully, history tells us that such occurrences only happen once in several generations. But as a photographer, I felt that I was actually somewhat disconnected. These things were happening around me, and I didn't know what it was that I was doing to try and capture my experience of those particular moments. We've been surrounded by images documenting the pandemic, and I felt that I really wasn't doing anything to capture my emotional response to the questions that I had. Or was I? That was a question I started to ask myself. Was I? I've been working more and more with abstract scenes during this time. And when I look back on them, I think I realized that my questions are really all there. So for example, I was visiting a bookstore in downtown Baltimore, and I just got fascinated by patterns in a painted window of a store that had recently closed as a result of the pandemic. It just really grabbed my attention. I did have my camera with me, and I started to put the viewfinder to my eye, and I just searched for patterns. And when they materialized, I just clicked the shutter. This one, again, it's in a very small area on the same window, the painted window. It reminded me of the branches of a tree. So to give you an example, I put this side by side with another version of the cottonwood tree that I saw in the canyons out in Moab, Utah. Or another example, that same scene with a different tree that I saw out in Death Valley, a little branch rather, a weed or whatever it was. But I often try and find humor in abstraction as well. So for example, in this particular scene, I found what I think looks like a carrot you see in a cartoon that has slipped on a banana skin and is falling backwards. It reminded me of the importance to even find humor in our most challenging times. And then these ones as well, the next couple of images, I just really enjoyed the relationship, not just of the design, the shape, but also the tonal relationship between the highlighted areas and the dark areas in the scene, in the background of the scene. So this led to the formation of another series of images that I would like to share with you that I call urban expressions. My journey to find beauty within the imperfect, it continues to this day. It's all around us, but it's all about how much attention we pay to it and our emotional response to it, whether it be good or bad. When we see it and feel it, again, just respond. And again, don't ask yourself too much or too many questions about how to photograph it, but rather why we photograph it. This was a complex scene on the front of an old building. It's clear that there were many layers of posters that have been pasted one on top of the other as time goes by. And it just made me realize it was more symbolic really of life, where there are many layers to life, and often one layer gets pasted over on top of another layer, etc., etc. So this one was the same. Again, life is layers, complex and sometimes pasted over and often not making an awful lot of sense. But I wanted to explore how we can reveal those layers, even if they're very small snippets. We often find perfection, or rather perfection in the imperfection, or the imperfection, whichever way you want to look at, in the abstract scenes often created by graffiti. this was just a drain cover on the floor. I was walking by and looking down and I saw it, and it just really grabbed my attention. The repetition of the shapes and the contrasting tones in the flat light reveal texture. And the drain cover is just simply a vehicle for shape and texture. And peeling paint is something that as photographers, most of us try to photograph. It's also a great way of revealing shape and texture. And again, just as another small technical snippet, I often prefer to photograph such scenes in flat light to balance shape and texture. Again, going back to that whole concept of harmony, balancing shape and texture for me creates harmonious situations. Direct light in this particular image would really focus too much attention on the texture. So again, I'm just really trying to balance the shape and the texture. And then this was a photograph that I took in Second Chance, an area down in downtown Baltimore that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's just some well splatter that was on the side of a piece of metal that had been welded upon God knows how long ago. But when I saw it and I was looking at it, a face just appeared to me from amongst the well splatter and the corrosion on the metal. And I, again, just responded to it and had to photograph it. This one is a very simple scene within a complex industrial landscape. Simplification is often the best way to focus attention onto something. And this was a scene that I worked from many different angles and viewpoints. But again, going back to one of the concepts that I mentioned earlier, when I looked at the roll of film, or rather the set of images, the series of images in the digital darkroom that I had taken in this particular scene, this was the first one, and this is the one that I ended up working with. And again, I'd like to think it's because this one was more representative of my instinctual response to the scene, rather than all of the thoughts and everything else that I try to layer on top of that instinctual response when I started to take other photographs. So to me, pictures come first and the composition comes after. If you're familiar with the photographer Stephen Shaw, we often talk about composition as a way of figuring out where to place individual components within an image, but we're really not just figuring out where to place components within an image. We're also looking at the relationship between dark and light, how the light is falling on a scene. We're looking at viewpoint. Are we going to look from above or from below? Stephen Shaw refuses to use the word composition. Instead, he uses the phrase, we solve a scene. We don't compose it, we solve it. This particular image is somewhat similar to the last one in terms of the simplicity. I don't think it would have worked if it wasn't for that small coffee cup. And again, it isn't so much about the subject, but rather the emotions it creates and the questions it raises. Who or what lived behind that shuttered window, and why was that cup left there in the corner and not in the middle? Did somebody just stop to rest and drink their coffee and just get up and walk away? Makes you ask questions. And I saw this leaf that just seemed to be caged within a chain link fence. Again, just responded to it instinctually. And then this one was in an old barn that we were wandering through. And I asked myself, why had somebody put these flowers in a mason jar in a barn and just left them there? And to end, if anybody can explain this to me, then please send me an email. There's actually a funny story associated with this one. This was actually taken down I was attending Nature Visions a few years ago in Manassas, Virginia, and went to the bathroom, and Cole Thompson was one of the keynote speakers at this the symposium, and I know Cole quite well. I'd not seen him for a couple of years, and there we were in the bathroom shaking hands, and we both saw this scene in front of us, and we both got down on our knees and started taking photographs, and other people wandered in and just saw us kneeling there and just walked straight back out again, thinking, what are these crazy guys doing? So I think in summary, what I want to say is, I really have no idea where my journey in photography will take me next. But what I do know is that I still have lots of questions. about this amazing, often crazy, unpredictable world that we live in. And I'll continue to use my photography to help me ask those questions, help me understand the world around me. At the end of the day, it's the questions that we ask of our emotional response to a scene that, for me, really allows us to capture something that is truly unique. We are all unique. And if we allow ourselves to be unique, our work will be unique. So remember, allow your heart to lead you. Photography should not be an intellectual exercise. And rather than asking questions about what you feel, just respond to the feeling. Just respond. So I guess in closing, I'd just like to say thank you for sitting through this for the last hour or so. And if there are any questions, Sandy, I guess we can take those.
Oh, we certainly will. So good. Yeah, stop sharing the screen, and there we are. I'm going to take the liberty of just saying what I'm walking away from. And, usually after we have a conversation, Arthur, I walk away and my head is just spinning. But tonight, what I'm walking away with is the idea of a heightened state of awareness. And as a street photographer, I think I get caught up in the moment, what's going on around me. And I am going to work on being present and having this heightened state of awareness so that I can see that moment that means something to me. So thank you. I have other notes that I've taken, but I'll let others ask you questions. So turn on your video and your video and ask away. So thank you, Arthur. As always, I'm just challenged and inspired and ready to go out and do some shooting. So thank you.
Thanks, Sandy.
Okay, who else?
So Arthur, I mean, as usual, you just blew me away with that. I feel like I should be paying you money for the therapy, and that's what kind of what I feel like that was like an existential experience for me, and it almost sounds like your photography was like a form of therapy for you, and it helped you to get through those dark times. It helped you. It wasn't, quote, just art. It was photography helped to heal you and bring you through the journey. I mean, I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, I think, obviously, unfortunately, grief and trauma is a part of life. We all go through it, we all experience it. But there are those times in your life where you're not experiencing trauma and grief, and they're as valuable a time in your life as any other time in your life. So photography for me is, it's great therapy, yes, when I'm trying to explore my response to trauma and grief, but it's also great therapy when I am intrigued about the wonder that is in the world around us, the people that are in the world, the landscape, our impact on the landscape, whether it be positive or negative. I think that for me, it's an exploration around why it is that I feel certain ways that I do about locations, about experiences that I have when I'm walking up in the mountains, in the fog or whatever. It's photography for me is just an important vehicle because I have all of these questions going on in my head around what it is that I'm actually experiencing. And I think that for me, photography just allows me to explore that. It isn't the end result. It's a part of my journey, my exploration around what it is that intrigues me about this amazing place that we live in, really.
So Arthur, there was a, I remember once you did a presentation and you talked about how much time you might spend on processing an image. And what I remember distinctly was you started with the crop and that you could spend hours and hours on the crop. And so what's fascinating about what you talked about tonight, to me at least, is you didn't talk about processing, and I think processing is a big part of what you do too. And so where's your mind and your heart when you're processing a picture, I guess, is the best way I can think of asking the question.
Yeah, it is a really good question. And I can tell you that, as I think I've mentioned in an earlier presentation, there's really two conversations that you're having. You're having one conversation when you are actually tripping the shutter. You're having a conversation with the scene that's in front of you, and your conversation is all around your emotional response to what it is that you're looking at. But then you're having a separate conversation when you are actually processing the image. So it can be an extension of the prior conversation, or it could be an entirely different conversation. I think the key, though, is to allow yourself, so when you're in this, as I mentioned, heightened state of awareness, as it was when you're taking the photograph, you got to figure out a way of putting yourself into a similar heightened state of awareness when you are actually working on that photograph to create an image. Again, it doesn't matter whether it's an extension of this prior conversation or an entirely new conversation. You got to put yourself in that emotional state of awareness, that heightened state of awareness. And I, when I'm taking photographs, I can only do it when I'm on my own. I can't do it when there's extraneous noises or sounds or anything. God forbid anybody ever asked me to take photographs out on the street anywhere. I couldn't do it because of the noises and the sounds. I need to be completely silent to allow myself to be in that heightened state of awareness. And it's the same when I'm processing my images. I can't do it when I got the kids running around or I've got anything else going on. So that's what I try and do. Yes.
Hey, Arthur. I heard you several times when you were saying that you was just wandering around like Kane in the movie, just walking around, and you just stopped and you just grabbed your tripod and you just hit the button. I'm hearing what you're saying right now. You're saying that you have to be in your own solitude for you to be able to make some type of craft of what you're trying to create, as well as you stated that at a time inside of your photography, you started to doubt yourself and contradict yourself. As you know, a lot of things you said I could relate because in this field, in this area, I'm trying to learn how to have the eye, and I'm fighting that challenge right now. I'm fighting that challenge, and I think because by me being so technical inside of the computer field, I think the biggest thing is I'm in my own way. I'm in my own way because I'm so used to doing certain things and having control of it. But in this area, it's not. You don't have control. You gotta like flow with it. So I'm trying to get a little bit more inspiration from you on that because I like how you said you were just walking like Kane and you just stopped and just set up, and then you didn't know what was going to come out of it. You just did it. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Again, it's not you finding the image. It's about the image finding you, and just allowing yourself to stop and be able to respond to it and put your camera down on the tripod, whatever it is, and just take a photograph of it. We get too wrapped up, unfortunately, in our minds, and I'm guilty of it the same as everybody else. You just get too wrapped up in thinking about whether or not whatever it is that you create, whatever photograph you take, whatever image it is that you create, is this going to be something that's going to be accepted by somebody else? And that image is going to be heavily influenced by every other photograph of a very similar scene that you've ever seen before. And understanding that and recognizing it is a part of the journey. For me, it's the next part of the journey is being able to take that and say, well, the image that I'm creating is more about my response to what I'm seeing and not so much everybody else's response to what they've seen, even though those images are stuck in my mind. So one of the other things that I would suggest that you do, and Cole Thompson has talked about this on every single presentation that he's ever done, and Cole's a phenomenal guy for anybody who ever has an opportunity to listen to one of his presentations. He often asks people, look at your images and pick out those ones that you like. And for those images that you like, pick out the ones that you really love. And there's a huge difference between the images that you like and the images that you love. And the images that you love are your images. The images that you like are likely to be largely influenced by other images that you've seen that are similar. The images that you love that really speak to you are the ones that are yours.
Thank you.
Could I just respond to what you, Joseph and Arthur just said, and just say, I think that going with what you were saying, Arthur, it's all about a personal journey. So for you and Joseph, it might be you need to find solitude. And so you need the solitude when you take the photos and the solitude when you process them. Maybe Sandy and I, who like doing street photography, need to be in a lot of noisy, boisterous situations. So maybe when you process the images, you should go to a cafe or turn on loud music. So I'm just being the devil's advocate and throwing it out there. There isn't any one way. It's just your way.
I think that's absolutely right, Diane. There is no one way because we're all different. And that's what makes photography so exciting for me. We're all different. And, you know, I don't like being on a busy street. I get nervous when I'm out on a busy street. I cannot become a part of the busy street. I need to get away from the busy street. So, yeah.
I love
Everybody
it.
works differently.
Okay. Who else would like to ask a question? And I want to give people who normally don't speak up, speak up. This is your chance. Who would like to ask a question? Come on.
Hey, or Ola?
Well,
Diane?
I've got a very trivial question.
No, it's not.
How many cameras have you gone through in your life? And when you go, when you go to the desert, obviously you take your tripod and a certain camera that will be good for those expensive landscapes. But sometimes you seem to have said that you see a scene and you point your camera because the scene speaks to you. Do you set up a tripod or do you have a different camera? How does it work?
Yeah, there's a lot in there. I think to answer the first question, how many cameras have I gone through? The answer is none, because I still have every single camera that I ever bought. I've never actually gone through them. I still have them. So they're all sat in a closet somewhere. But to answer the second part of your question, which for me is more interesting, you know, it's actually going back to a point that Joseph was alluding to. I think there are two sides to photography. There is the technical side and there is the emotional side. And I think that for me, one of the things that I feel is really important is to get to a certain level with yourself that you feel comfortable with technically, to a point where you don't have to think about the settings on your camera. You don't have to think about, well, what f-stop, how do I get the f-stop? What's the aperture setting? What do I, you know, what is the shutter speed that I need to set here? What ISO do I need to set? How do I set my camera up on the tripod? The minute you start filling your mind with all of those technical questions, you've already lost the moment. You know, you've already lost the moment. So getting to a certain level of comfort with your camera and your gear, vitally important, because you're no longer having to think about it. You know instinctively where the dials are to set your aperture and to set your shutter speed and to set your ISO. You know exactly how to drop it on top of the tripod, and you know exactly how far to extend the legs on the tripod so that you're going to be at eye level or whatever level it is. So I think that getting yourself to a certain degree of comfort with your technical capability, and then move on to another level. You know, move on to another level. Get yourself more technical proficient in another area. So,
but do you normally use a tripod when you shoot?
I'm sorry, what was that, Ola?
Do you normally use a tripod always?
I wouldn't say that I always use a tripod. It's probably about 50-50 for me.
Oh, okay.
Again, sometimes there is just something there, and you know, I love to walk, and a tripod is freaking heavy. I don't want to, sometimes I don't want to walk with a tripod, so I'll just take my camera with me. I use a Fuji system primarily because it's very light and it's easy to carry. I'm not sat with a 40 or 50-pound backpack of just camera gear. So I just have my Fuji with me. So no, I won't carry the tripod all the time. So I'll just photograph without it.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah, I like the way you you told your journey, I guess, how your style has changed, because I know my style has changed, and I don't even really know how to relate to some previous styles that I've had, even though I feel like I like the photos, that they were successful as far as other people like them too, or at least I like them a lot. And it feels like sometimes that part, that phase maybe sometimes just dies. Like you can't really relate to it. You might have, you can remember taking the photo, but you can't really relate to doing it again. So you move on to something else. And I kind of like, well, I mean, I don't want to say that that's what you were doing, but I mean, you have these different phases, and I kind of like that.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right, Scott. And again, it's not some, in terms of style for me is a horrible, horrible conversation to have, because it means so many different things to so many different people. And each of us need to be able to put our own definition together about what style means to us. So for me, I was all bent out of shape about style because I thought it was all associated with what you photograph. Your style is a landscape photographer, your style is a street photographer or an architectural photographer. But what I came to realize, that style is not so much about what it is that you photograph, but how you do it. And again, take a photograph of a person, a building, a plant, a tree, whatever it is, take a close look at it and you'll find something within each and every one of the images that you create that is common. That's the style. That's your style. It's whatever it is that ties all of those images together.
Yeah. I find that it's not, I've been trying to find labels for myself. And if somebody asks, I can still give them a few labels, but it's just hard for me to find a label sometimes. And also, if I bring too many things with me, it just doesn't work.
Why do we need a label?
Yeah, I was going to say, don't try and find labels. Labels are horrible.
I think at one time I thought it was useful for me, and then maybe doing without it, I thought it was kind of weird. But that's just my own internal conversation.
I have a question. I loved the images of your daughter. I thought they were incredibly moving.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know how much of a collaboration that was between you and your daughter, how much you pre-visualized what you wanted to shoot. And there seemed to be a lot of symbolism in the images, and I was hoping that you would talk a little bit more about that too.
Yeah, she was very collaborative. She was, I think, as a middle child, she is, the typical middle child where she's just seeking attention. So any opportunity that she had to spend one-on-one time with me, I think was, she was craving it. So she was very excited about doing it. She was a very willing muse, and she was very patient with me. But again, I didn't consciously pick her. I subconsciously picked her to take photographs. I haven't taken similar photographs of my other kids. And again, as I mentioned during the presentation, I think a big part of the reason for that is because she is so different from me. I think that she is so different from me as a child. She's just a very different child, very extroverted. I found it difficult to make friends. She can stand in the middle of a group of kids that she's never met before, and within 5 minutes they're all running around and chasing her and just having a friendly kind of a time, and they become good friends. So I think that, going back to the question of symbolism, I was trying to explore my own childhood through her. So I was trying to, if you would, project my childhood into her and creating that sense of loneliness, that sense of introversion, that sense of isolation, and my childhood experiences onto this kid who was completely different from who I was.
Arthur, I'm gonna ask you this real quick. if you can answer it. I may be answering the question again, but can you? No, I'm gonna step back. I'm gonna step back. I lost the thought.
Arthur, I find, I mean, you put words to things that I feel like I feel. When I'm out shooting, I find that I just see things more. It makes me a more active participant in what I'm seeing. Sometimes I'll feel that way and don't have my camera and I feel empty. But shooting just makes me interact with the world in a more powerful and intimate way, I think.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Tom. I mean, for me, that's exactly what photography is. And, you know, it sounds a little cliche, but for me, the journey is the destination. You know, we talk about where is it that you're trying to go with your photography, and you think about it in terms of a destination. But for me, it's not really. The journey itself is the destination. So when I'm out there and I'm in the world and I'm in my own little space, the camera is just an extension of, it's just an extension of me. It's just capturing the experience of where I am in that particular journey.
Thanks, Tom. That's what I was trying to hear too. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
We was on the same page.
How about somebody else?
I have a question.
Good.
Arthur, when you were talking about grief, your grief photography, were you aware of grief photography, or was that something you just started doing on instinct and then you found out about it later? That's similar to my own experience. Although one of the first formal photography courses I took in recent years was actually a online grief photography course, but it was something I was already kind of like driven to do. I just didn't understand it.
Yeah, I think that, you know, again, yes, I was experiencing those things because of what was happening, but the reality was I was trying to escape it. You know, I couldn't sit in the house with everything that was going on. I needed to be out with my camera and doing something. It wasn't until I looked at the images after the fact, when I'd taken the photographs and then sat down and worked them in post-processing, it wasn't until after the fact that I realized that everything that I was feeling and experiencing at that particular time was there in the images. I wasn't trying to capture images of that experience, but inherent within the images that I created was the experience and the feelings that I had. Okay, I think you're on mute if you're asking a question.
Right, sorry. Yeah, I'm just curious. I love that set of pictures, by the way. And if you were to go to the exact same spot, and it's been a fun day, and you're in a different mood totally, would you have taken the same picture?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And as an extension to that as well, Kay, I think that if I was to sit down in front of one of the raw files from that particular shoot, and that shoot was what, 4 years ago now, if I was to sit down with one of the raw files in front of my computer and started working it, I would likely come up with a very different result. I would come up with a very different answer.
Interesting, very interesting.
Yeah, it's all about frame of mind. Again, it's going back to the question that Harry asked. You know, it's all around the conversation that you have. You know, at the time there was a conversation that I was having with myself, and that ended up manifesting itself in the images that I created. Today, the conversation is very different. So I would expect that the resulting images would be very different as well.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have ways you get ready to go out and shoot to get into a frame of mind so that you can question instead of intellectualize?
Yeah, I think that the one thing I like to say, and it sounds like a joke, but it's really not. Photography is not a team sport. You know, it really is about yourself. You know, so I think for me, when I go out and take photographs, the first thing that I have to do is I've got to be on my own. I can't be with a group of other people. And again, I know that we're all different and other people enjoy being out with a group of other people taking photographs. So to answer the question about what can I do to prepare myself, number one, I've got to be alone. And number two, I think I've just got to feel it. I just, you know, again, going back to the images that I created when my mother was really ill, I just needed to get out. I just needed to go out. I just needed to walk. I just needed to be out somewhere. I couldn't sit in the house. So I think that in preparing yourself, just mentally telling yourself you need to be somewhere other than where you are at this particular moment in time.
So, although to counter that, Arthur, there's no I in photography. There's no I in team. So this actually also for me, it harkens back to, I know we've had this discussion where I went to Japan, I went to Kyoto, took all these wonderful photos, and I thought, oh my gosh, these are going to be great. And I come back and I just hated them all. But maybe I didn't have myself in the right frame of mind. So maybe I should go revisit those photos. And maybe that's something for everyone on the call. If you came back from a trip and didn't like some photos, or even if you did like them, it's good to maybe go and revisit some of your photos. And maybe we'll just do the Arthur Ransome, There Is No Spoon, The Matrix kind of chill factor to get ourselves in our own personal spot and assess them. And maybe I'll like all those images from Kyoto again.
I'm really not all that crazy, Diane, but thank you. But no, seriously, one of the fun
just
things
crazy enough.
Yeah, just crazy enough. One of the things that I really enjoy doing, just to that particular point though, Diane, is unfortunately because of my day job over the last couple of years, I haven't had much of a chance to go out and take photographs as much as I would like. And as much as I just answered that you need to get out and just do it, I just found it really difficult to do it. So one of the things that I do, and I found myself doing, is going back and looking through images from old shoots, stuff that when I got back from a shoot and looked at the images in front of my computer, nothing struck me, nothing grabbed my attention. But all of a sudden, after a year, 2 years, 3 years, stuff is just jumping out and it's grabbing my attention and I need to work it. So I found myself doing that an awful lot. I mean, I don't throw away any images at all, not a single one. Hard drive space is really cheap.
Yeah, 5 terabyte at Costco is $89.
Arthur, Banff is one of my favorite places too. But have you gotten further north up into Jasper and up in there, further up the Icefields Parkway?
Yeah, absolutely. Patty, who's on the call right now, she and I did a little bit of a road trip from Banff, drove up through the ice fields all the way up to Jasper and spent a few days in Jasper. Amazing place. One of those places that, you know, love to go back as many times as I possibly could. For me, it would be right up there with the likes of Death Valley. I've lost count of the number of times I've been to Death Valley. There's just something that draws me there. And Jasper, if it was a little more accessible, a little easier to get to, would be one of those places that I would go back to again and again and again.
Well,
Have you been to Moraine Lake there?
Yeah.
And Patty, did you want to say
Patty?
something? Hi.
Yeah, go ahead.
It
Sorry.
was the best birthday gift ever.
Well,
Yeah, it's gorgeous up there.
I'd been to Banff and Jasper before I met my wife, and she's frankly more of an outdoors person than I am. But I kept telling her it was one of my favorite places. We had to go there, and we went up there, and we just had a really, really wonderful time. And I find, you say you like to shoot by yourself, I do too, but I find I shoot a lot when I'm traveling with my wife, and she's usually patient enough to let me do that.
Yeah, that's the key right there.
Hey Arthur, this is Suku. How are you?
Good. How are you doing, Suku?
I'm good. I had a quick question. I think I've asked you this before. How quickly do you go back to your computer and start developing your image or processing your image, if that's the right word?
Yeah, it varies, Suku. You know, if, for example, I was out in Death Valley last year, around this time actually, in mid-late March, and I was out there on my own, so I was able to actually start processing images after a day's shoot. So I would, you know, still in the same frame of mind, I would start working on images. But that's not always the case. Often, if I am the other morning, actually a couple of weeks ago now, we had a lot of fog around here, and I went out just around Loch Raven, took some photographs. I have yet to look at them. So, you know, so it varies. If I can process them pretty soon after I have taken the photographs, I would prefer to do that. But I'm not always afforded that luxury. So unfortunately, sometimes I have to leave them a while before I'll get back to them. And it goes back to a question that was asked earlier around how do you get yourself back into that right frame, you know, that same frame of mind? How do you do that when you're looking at your images several days or even weeks or months often after you've taken them? So
I think I find that my processing changes if my mood changes. If I have a couple of beers and work on the processing, it gives me a different feel to it, to be honest. And yeah, if I'm in a bad mood or something, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's so different when you process the same image at two different times in your time frame, and you get two different results.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
Just drink some beers when you're taking the photo, Suku. And then it'll match.
Yep. I should carry my backpack will get heavier.
Arthur, what resonated for me was not having a preconceived notion of what you want to shoot. I like going out there, and I'll just set up my tripod and look through the viewfinder and see what's there.
Yeah.
Sometimes some of the best images I've gotten was I just set the camera up and I go, oh my God, look at that.
And just hit the shutter button. That's it.
Yep. That's it.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree completely. And I've been, you know, the same as everybody else, you tend to try and overthink an image. You tend to overthink it both technically, then you start to think about it, you know, is this going to be accepted? How would so-and-so and so-and-so take this photograph? And how can I get this photograph to look like Ansel Adams or Edward Weston or whatever, you know? At that point, as I think I'd said in the presentation, one of the quotes from Edward Weston, once you start to think about it, you've already lost it. It's already too late. Yeah.
It's got to speak to you.
Yeah.
Well, and don't be afraid to let your crazy out. Some people who haven't entered photos because they're afraid of showing themselves, right? I think just be confident in your own vision, and it doesn't matter what a judge thinks or what other people think. You're just sharing your own art and your own vision. So.
Oh, you're talking about me again. Oh.
I look back at some of my old images, and you know, we went a little crazy with the HDR there, but I still like those images. I wouldn't do it now, but I still like those images.
Yeah, Arthur, I think one of the things you just said is something that John Barclay kind of preaches, is let the photos come to you.
Yeah. Yeah, John's a very spiritual person, and he is a great believer in exactly that. You know, the image will always find you, and the reason it finds you is because you and it are connected.
I think I need to get a lost party because that image haven't found me yet.
It will.
It's on a milk carton somewhere, Joseph.
Hey.
It's on a milk carton somewhere.
Hey,
You
there's
know-
sometimes I could go out for a few days and it's just all crappy images, and like a few trips in a row, they're all crappy. I mean, it's just like if you went bowling and you had a crappy night. I mean, it's the same thing, right? It's just not going to work all the time. Sometimes it just doesn't work,
Well, I
and
tell
you
you,
just have to do it.
I tell you what, I'm not gonna be able to make this trip because I got called for jury duty. But the next trip we go out, I go with y'all guys. And y'all probably gonna be laughing at me all day because y'all gonna see me chasing the image while the image is coming to y'all guys. So just remember this night. I'm trying to catch that moment.
Okay.
Nobody will be laughing at.
So I guess that's my point, Joseph. Don't try and capture it. Don't chase it. It'll
Let it
find,
run to you.
It'll find you.
And Arthur, one thing you said tonight that, I'm sort of scratching my head thinking about, wow, what does he mean? And you said, rather than compose a scene, you said solve a scene. And so, I'm a street photographer, so I'm not, how would I apply that while I'm out on the street?
Yeah, I'm not a street photographer, so I don't know that I'm going to be able to give you a very very good answer. But what I will tell you is Stephen Shaw, when he talks about solving a photograph as opposed to composing it, composing seems to suggest that you're only interested in what it is that you include within the frame, your angle of viewpoint, and where you place all of the different elements within the frame to create those relationships. What Stephen Shaw is talking about is there are other things, other decisions that you have to make around lighting. All of those, the relationships between light and shadow, those types of things also are important parts of whatever it is you want to call composition. So he tried to get away from using the concept of composition and call it solving, because you're not just focused on where you're going to place the subjects within the frame. You're also looking at how light affects the scene, how shadow affects the scene, and the relationships between your foreground, the ground, and your subject.
But
And
Sandy,
if-
I think you do that sometimes just by some of the photos I've seen that you've taken, your explanations of, I saw this and just waited for somebody to walk into it.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Jim. That's one of the things that I was gonna. There was a street photographer did a presentation a while ago who spoke very eloquently about this, and I think that was paraphrasing Henry Cartier-Bresson when he talks about life is just a stage, and it's all about finding that stage, finding the scene, and something will happen. Something will happen within that moment. So you've already got your scene. Life is a stage. Enter left, exit right. Yes.
And if I could just add one more thing, and I think Kay, I think you wanted to ask a question, but just so before we leave, I think Sandy and Arthur was involved with this too, where find what you like about a scene. So he was saying he took that big wide picture of the landscape, but what he really liked were these little things. And so there was a picture, remember, in one of the critiques, you showed a picture of a little boy paddling a bike or something. And Arthur said, why don't you just crop it from the waist on down, right? And that was what made the image most exciting. So maybe try and figure out what you like of the scene. Maybe you want to take a picture of the musician's hands rather than the whole musician or something like that, right?
Yeah, and Arthur asked me on that one image, what made my heart sing? What about that image? And it was the boy's feet and the shadow. And that's what I cropped out. Thank you, Arthur.
Well, one of the things I found interesting about some of Arthur's images tonight, which is probably what I would not have done and makes me rethink, is especially in some of the landscapes, there was a lot of open sky at the top. And if I had been cropping that or processing that, I would have cropped it down some, but it was very effective the way you used it, I thought. So makes me rethink what I'm doing a little bit.
Well, I think that just to that, it's actually a lesson that I learned as well, Tom, and it was a very hard lesson to learn. And that is, we often think about, we've only got this frame, we've only got so much real estate within which to put a subject. So we often think about how we've got to fill the frame with that subject. How many times have you heard people say that? Fill the frame with the subject. What that tends to do is it forces you to forget about space. It forces you to forget about what for me is an extremely important part of a scene, and that is the space that surrounds a subject. It's not about just filling the frame with the subject. It's about filling the frame with the space within which the subject exists.
Arthur, you mentioned someone called Stephen Shar. Is it C-H-A-R?
No, that's my Britishism. It's S as in seashore, S-H-O-R-E.
Oh, Stephen Shore. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. That's all right. It's me, not you.
Hey, did you have a question?
No,
Oh, okay. Sorry. I thought I interrupted you earlier.
no. I'm just listening to everybody else's. It's been a very interesting discussion period. And yeah, and a most interesting presentation. I loved it.
Thank you very much, Kay. That means a lot.
Yeah.
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 Seriously.
Arthur, you helped me out a lot. The funny part about it is I'm very good in video editing. I'm a bum photography. So I might as well just get me a fishing rod and sit there with the camera on the end and wait for that moment.
You're just giving yourself a mind job. Isn't like a video the same thing as a photo, but there's just 24 of them per second?
Yeah, just hit the pause button a few hundred times.
Why did you do that? Why? I was hoping you was gonna let that slide right on by, but I knew you wasn't. Why? I know it's 24.
Shake you out of your zone, man.
I know it's 24
Anyways.
stills moving. I'm trying to catch one of them. That's the point.
Hey, Joseph, just real quick, Joseph. I'm going to paraphrase Steve Jobs. Okay, there are three things. There are three things that you need to be successful: passion, knowledge, and hard work. And Steve Jobs suggested that you can actually be successful with just two of those, as long as one of them is passion.
Yeah.
So if you're passionate about your photography, if you're knowledgeable, you'll succeed. If you're passionate about your photography and you're willing to work hard at it, you will succeed. So you figure out where you are with that. But to me, it sounds like you're extremely passionate about it, and it sounds like you want to work hard. So give yourself a lot of credit. You will get to be where you want to be.
I'm just having fun beating myself up. That's all.
So you're so introverted, I can tell.
From somebody who also beats themselves up frequently, freaking stop it.
Yep.
All right.
All right. On that note, Arthur, it has been an amazing evening. I can tell by the comments tonight just how much people have enjoyed it. We feel honored that you would spend an evening with us, helping us think about questions and not answers. So thank you so much, Arthur.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Arthur.
More
Yeah.
cowbell.
Thank you.
Great weekend, everybody.
So
Thank you.
I'm going to say goodnight to everybody, and I'm going to encourage us all to ask questions.
Thanks, Sandy.
Okay.
Have a good night.
Okay.
Good
Thank
night.
you.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Good night.